My name is Adam Semensky. I am the James R. Schlesinger Chair for Energy and Geopolitics here at CSIS. Before we start in and introduce everybody today, I'm to always give the safety lecture. If anything happens and we're not expecting anything to happen, no fire drills planned, the best thing to do is follow Frank Verastro. He's sitting in the back and he'll be the first one out the door, and everybody gets right behind him. Whichever way he goes is going to be the way we get out of the building. Okay. The CSIS Energy and National Security Program is pleased today to host Masakazu Toyoda, who's the chairman and CEO of the Institute of Energy Economics in Japan. He'll be presenting on the IEEJ's Energy Outlook for 2018, a report which deals with the future of the world's energy system. The 2018 edition of the Outlook has broadened its analysis out to the year 2050, which now matches the EIA's time frame if you go into the tables in the EIA numbers. So that's great. We're beginning to see kind of longer term projections. Kazu Toyoda has been at the IEEJ since 2010. He previously served as Japan's Vice Minister for International Affairs. He did that for the period from 2007 to 2010. He joined the International Affairs Ministry after being at the International Trade and Industry Ministry in 1973. Before, he held positions in the OECD and the International Energy Agency. He has very broad knowledge of the areas of trade, energy, and the environment. Toyoda-san was involved in the foundation we're going to switch microphones. When he was at APEC, he helped negotiate in addition to being at APEC, he helped negotiate the Japan-U.S. automobile agreements. He was deeply involved in the Kyoto Protocol and the Doha Development Round. He holds a master's in public administration from the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton University. So let me just briefly outline a couple of things that Toyoda-san will be discussing. The IEEJ Outlook finds, despite large improvements in energy efficiency and intensity, that global energy demand is likely to increase up to the 2050 timeframe. Most of that growth coming from economic development in the non-OECD Asian area. Energy-related carbon dioxide emissions in the advanced technology scenario do decline after the 2020s, but are still pretty far from reaching half of current levels by 2050. So there would be a way to go yet. One of the things that Toyoda-san has been very interested in is the opportunity for nuclear, carbon-free nuclear power to contribute in that period 2040 out to 2050 to a lower carbon scenario. 2/3 of the total reductions in carbon come from electricity-related technologies, including non-fossil power, thermal power with carbon capture and sequestration, and energy efficiency and power supply and demand. But Toyoda-san is going to be able to discuss this in much greater detail than I'm going to do. So please, won't you join me now in welcoming Kazu Toyoda.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Adamson, for our kind introduction. I am very comfortable to be here because my professor is here. Guy Caruso was my boss when I was working for IEEJ, and since then he is always my professor, and that's what Adamson didn't tell you. My name is Toyoda. It's a very easy name to remember, but I would caution I have no connection with Toyota family. I do not want to disappoint you later, so at the beginning I would disappoint you. What I am trying to do is to discuss three things. How can I do this? So, this one? Oh, no. Doesn't work? Sorry.
Which one?
So many buttons, I'm sorry.
Too many buttons, all right. There. So press this side.
Okay, with this side. Three issues. First, as Adam said, I'm talking about energy outlook up to 2050. It's the reason why we try to do that is that the future is more predictable than today, sometimes, and so I think I could explain to you at least two scenarios. Probably it is interesting to you, but at the same time, the future is not predictable enough, and sometimes we need scenario analysis. That's what peak oil demand case. We try to have a sort of scenario analysis. And the third one is climate change. Since we try to extend our outlook up to 2050, why not talking about climate change? I think climate change is very important, but the target year is 2050. And so this is why we try to cover climate change for this energy outlook. Before going to the energy outlook issue, perhaps this might be quite interesting. I simply try to pick up 5 countries or regions, how they look like in 2050, in terms of 4 indicators. First, population. Maybe this one. Okay. India is going to be the largest. It's very interesting. China, maybe one-child policy. Even though they change their policy, it doesn't work so well. And so India is going to surpass China in terms of population. Japan, by 2050, somehow we could keep the population with around 100 million, but it's growing, it's declining since after that 1 million per year. So it's a huge decline unless we do anything meaningful. And GDP, I don't know whether you like this chart, but mid-30s, perhaps in China.
I'm going to move this just a little closer.
Sorry, China is going to surpass the United States. I don't know. It's simply projection, but it might be interesting to remind you about that. GDP per capita, US, Japan, in a better position. And total primary energy consumption, yes, China continue to be the largest consumers. Well, having said that, let me explain 3 scenarios which we try to talk about. The first is a different scenario, and second, advanced technology scenario, and the third one is peak oil scenario. And different scenario is a simply extension of the current energy policy. Advanced technology scenario, which is trying to have a more aggressive policy to address climate change. And the third one is peak oil demand case. We have some assumptions. I think many institutions, including IEA and other major oil companies, try to have those scenario analysis, but I try to encourage them to disclose what sort of assumptions they are trying to have. They are not willing to do that, but by showing those numbers, vehicle technology, coal-fired plant, installed capacity in terms of several renewable energy, we purposely try to show the numbers. By doing that, we try to encourage them to disclose their own assumptions. I don't have to go into detail. You may have time later on if you have interest. But let me explain to you, peak oil demand case, what sort of assumption we made. It's the share of sales of zero emission vehicle, including electric vehicle and fuel cell automobile. But you could see the numbers. A different case, 9%, advanced technology, 21% for 2030, and peak oil demand case, 30%. And then 2050, 20%, 40%, and 100%. And what would happen if we have such numbers? So first, let me go to difference case. On the basis of difference case, simply extension of the current policy, GDP goes up 2.5 times larger than the current. But the energy, only 1.4, which means energy efficiency is getting better. But still, it's not declining. It's continue to grow. And by region, you could see Asian countries center of energy consumption. But interesting thing is that now India is the biggest consumer compared with China in terms of growth rate, and also Asia is increasing their energy consumption. There are several interesting aspects. If you look at electricity, even OECD countries would show increase in the electricity consumption. But for oil, OECD countries show decline in terms of oil consumption. But for non-OECD countries, both electricity and oil would continue to grow. And so 2/3 of growth for those energy is being seen by non-OECD countries. If you look at fossil fuel, how it goes, as far as reference case continuation of existing policy, even 2050, almost 80% of primary energy is for fossil fuel. Because of that, if you look at CO2 emission, the emission continues to grow almost 30%. Now, let me show you how advanced technology scenario which is going to adopt more aggressive energy conservation or the introduction of zero carbon energy policy goes. And we could see clearly the reduction in energy consumption, but perhaps only 15% or so. It's not huge. And transportation and power generation, here we would see a bigger decline compared with other sectors. And particularly, we have a very interest in what would happen in transportation sector. I would come back to this issue with respect to oil peak demand case. Please look at the power generation. Even though GHG continues to grow, different scenario, zero carbon energy is quite large, 40%. But now, if you look at the advanced technology scenario, almost 60% is zero carbon power generation. And in terms of capacity, in particular, we are the variable renewable energy. The share is almost 50% for advanced technology scenario. But still, you know, in terms of energy consumption, fossil fuel can play quite a great role. And if you look at the trend of primary energy consumption, there's an interesting feature here. Renewable energy is going to increase like this. Nuclear is also growing, and coal is coming down, and so here renewable energy would surpass the share of coal, but gas will continue to grow. And renewable energy is important, but gas is more important. And the biggest decline can be seen in the coal sector, and oil could be the next. Renewable energy would be quite important, particularly for advanced technology scenario. Maybe this is not very much surprising. This is what you can expect quite easily. But I just wanted to draw your attention to this chart. I'm sorry. Okay. This is about CO2 emission. Different scenario is simply continuation of existing policy. The CO2 continue to grow. perhaps almost 40% or so. And actually, the sum of NDC, which was submitted to Paris Agreement, is almost in line with these numbers. And so it's simply a continuation of existing policies. If we look at the advanced technology scenario, yes, CO2 can come down, but only 10%. And this is 450 ppm scenario, which IPCC is trying to advocate. Even with advanced technology scenario, it is very far away from 450 ppm scenario. I would come back on this issue, but what I just wanted to emphasize here is that even with advanced technology scenario, we cannot address climate change as expected. And the question is whether or not it is the end of the world. And my answer, or at least the answer of IEEJ is no. We can survive. How we can do that? That's a question. Before going into the climate change issue, let me explain what we found in the case of peak oil peak demand case. This is simply what is happening. Different scenario, yes, oil continue to grow, particularly road transportation or other transportation. Oil can continue to grow, but if you look at OECD country and non-OECD country classification, yes, OECD country oil demand can continue to decline. On the other hand, non-OECD countries, it continue to grow. So on average, oil will continue to grow in terms of consumption. But what is happening now is many countries try to ban combustion engine type of automobile. It is Germany, Norway, France, United Kingdom, and India as well, and China. And so major auto companies need to respond. And so this is why we wanted to make analysis on peak demand oil case. I hope you remember, we have assumption by 2030 the share of zero emission vehicle could be 30%, and by 2050 it could be 100%. And then what would happen is that we will see peak demand case. The peak could be reaching around 2030. This is different scenario. This is advanced technology scenario. But if we assume a very high share of zero emission vehicle, we would see peak demand around 2030. And if you look at the classification of non-OECD or OECD, even non-OECD country, you would see the peak demand around 2030. Well, perhaps this is not surprising, but the interesting thing is what sort of implication we can see from this case. First, it's not surprising. Oil would come down, and CO2 would also come down, but even though electricity goes up. And so oil is going to be a sort of stranded asset in a sense. But the second interesting implication is that sort of composition of oil production is going to change quite rapidly. This orange part is showing the share of gasoline. It's not surprising the share of gasoline is going to shrink, and this is diesel. Also, the share is going to decrease. But for diesel oil, there are some other usage rather than transportation. So the shrinking rate is smaller, but this composition of oil products are completely different from this one. And so oil refinery need to adjust themselves to this possible change if really peak demand, oil peak demand takes place. The third implication is that crude oil production shifts to low-cost regions. So it's a very good news for OPEC country, particularly Middle East, because they are the lowest production cost countries. And so even by 2050, the production in Middle East continue to grow. But other countries, other OPEC countries, even North America, which is including the United States, the production would come down. And former Soviet Union, Latin America, and Asia, most of them, or I would say all of them, will show a decline in production. So it's good news for Middle East because their production cost is so low. But here is bad news for Middle East. Unfortunately, I'm sorry, it doesn't work. Okay. We can easily understand when oil peak demand comes, the price starts coming down. And we suppose that the oil price goes up to 2030 around $100 per barrel, and by 2050 it could be $125 per barrel. But suppose we would see the price comes down up to say $65 in 2030 and $50 per barrel in 2050. Clearly, the economic impact on Middle East is quite serious. Having that number, we found this much GDP decline in Middle East, almost 15%. But this is good news for importing country, India, Japan, and China and Europe. The United States, almost plus minus zero. It's very interesting. So I think good news for Middle East is that the production shifts to Middle East, but since the price declines, the economic impact on Middle East is very much serious. And then what we can see is that perhaps we have to understand there will be a geopolitical risk in Middle East, and so nobody knows the net effect could be positive or negative for oil-consuming countries as well. And another implication is that in terms of pollution, yes, NOx would decrease quite substantially, and PM 2.5 would decline as well. So in terms of pollution, it could be okay. But it's another interesting implication. If you rely on tax revenue from oil, well, in the case of Japan, we have gasoline tax, consumption tax, and carbon tax. And those tax revenue would decline quite a lot. So, and so policymakers need to understand they have to restructure the tax policy. So there are a lot of implications with respect to this oil demand peak case. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. For some countries it's good, for some other countries it's not necessarily good. But the biggest implication is that, well, there are a lot of explanation, but the biggest implication from this analysis that we had to go back to this chart. Even when we see the decline in peak, decline in oil consumption after peak demand oil period, in 2050, almost the same level of oil consumption is needed as today, which means we have to continue to make upstream investment. At this moment, I think most companies, most governments are reluctant to increase investment in upstream sector in oil. But even in the case of peak oil demand case, we need quite a lot of oil even in 2050 as of today. And so this is also important, and particularly even for oil-producing countries and oil-consuming countries. We need to think about this. It may be stranded asset, but it's not that much stranded asset. So upstream investment needs to be made. So let me turn to climate analysis. Again, let me come back to this chart. Different scenario, or even advanced technology scenario, it may not sufficient to meet at least 450 ppm scenario, and the question is whether or not we are going to face the end of the world. As I said at the beginning, no, it is not necessarily the end of the world. Why we cannot reduce CO2 so rapidly? The question, the answer to that question is very simple. Most countries, not only developing countries, but also developed countries, they need, or we need, economic growth. So the economic growth would somehow be continued even when we try to address climate change. And then what can be said? The reason why we cannot address climate change as IPCC is trying to advocate is that if we make a huge mitigation, the cost is quite large. Yes, damage may be minimized, adaptation cost may be minimized, but mitigation cost is so large, and then that would have an adverse impact on economic growth. And so we try to identify 3 cases here. This is what IPCC is hoping to see. On the other hand, this is a different scenario. We don't make sufficient amount of efforts to reduce GHG, and then mitigation cost is smaller or smallest, but damage is going to be large, and adaptation cost may be also large. So here, what IEEJ would like to advocate is that path 2, which is the total cost minimization approach. The total cost means the sum of damage, adaptation cost, and mitigation cost. And this is path 2. But the problem with this cost minimization approach is that if you look at GHG emission, GHG concentration, and temperature rise, this middle line is cost minimization approach. And the problem could be the temperature rise is over 2 degree. And if we try to meet the requirement of 2 degree, perhaps this cost minimization approach may not work. This is a different scenario. This is a sort of 450 ppm scenario. So 450 pp scenario is good in terms of meeting 2 degree scenario or 2 degree target. But the challenge is whether or not we could enjoy the continuation of economic growth. So here is another scenario. We would put another constraint on this cost minimization approach, constraint to meet 2 degree target. And this green line is 4th scenario, which is cost minimization approach with a constraint of to meet 2 degree target. And then the cost could be a little bit larger compared with cost minimization approach, but it could be half cost of the 450 ppm scenario. What would happen is that it could be overshoot around the year 2100, but by 2150, it could be coming down to 2 degree target. And so this would mean we are not going to the end of the world. And so the question is how we could achieve this 2 degree cost minimization scenario. The answer is development of new technology. I think there could be various new technology, next generation nuclear reactor, including SMR, nuclear fusion, space solar power, hydrogen production from even fossil fuel in combination with CCS and CCU, carbon capture and usage, and famous BECCS, bioenergy with CCS, and there could be many. But I highlighted this hydrogen production from fossil fuel in combination with CCS because that would help the challenges of Middle East countries. They may lose exportable product by 2050, but if they can convert fossil fuel into zero carbon hydrogen, they could continue to export zero carbon energy to other countries. But this is only one of them. But it could resolve the problem of Middle East countries, which may be good for even oil-producing country, because Middle East, if they have a problem with respect to economic growth, then the Middle East would have a geopolitical chaos. And so this hydrogen production from fossil fuel in combination with CCS technology could be good for both oil producing and consuming countries. If we try to do that, we have to reduce the cost of those new technology, space, solar power, IGCC, hydrogen power, by 2050 this much, which is $85 per ton. So important thing is how we could realize. It's through, it can be realized only through international collaboration. So the important thing is international collaboration. If it is only Japan, we cannot realize. If we can work with the United States or even with Middle East countries, we could achieve such a technological development. If we try to understand how many plants, for instance, for hydrogen power, we need 1 gigawatt multiplies 3,000 units. And the same thing can be said if we try to utilize fuel cell vehicles, we need 1 billion units. And BECCS, SPS, fusion, etc., etc. And so it could be any kind of technology, but perhaps hydrogen from fossil fuel could be quite realistic, and particularly when Middle East countries have interest in working with us. So even when we cannot realize 450 ppm scenario, this is not necessarily the end of the world. If we can work together in developing new technology, we could have 2-degree cost minimizing scenario, which is, we tend to say, pragmatic approach to address climate change. Perhaps I think I can stop here, and I'd like to have your comments and questions. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Toyoda-san. I have one comment and one quick question before we turn to our guests. The comment is that in the peak oil demand scenario, you point out that one of the challenges is that lower oil demand could result in lower oil prices or less revenue to some of the oil-producing countries, leading to geopolitical problems, leading to price spikes, leading to economic downturn, which then completely reverses in part of the intended effect of what you're trying to accomplish with the peak oil demand scenario. So it's going to be very challenging indeed, I think, to sort out all of the unintended consequences associated with that. My quick question is the role of nuclear power in the minimized cost scenario, and what can you tell us about what's been happening in Japan recently on trying to bring back nuclear electricity?
Well, Advocate, thank you very much for your comment and also question. What is happening in Japan with respect to nuclear is try to keep nuclear at the level of 20% or 22% out of total power generation. And at this moment, we have only 5 reactors in operation. In order to achieve that target, 20 or 22%, we need around 30 reactors in operation. Here is a challenge. I think we established independent regulatory body, which is welcome. But their inspection speed is very slow. So only 1 reactor per year or something like that. But maybe because of the learning curve, we could speed it up. But there are 2 other problems. One is court judgment would disturb the reoperation itself. Actually, mid-December, 1 reactor which was on operation was somehow stopped by the court judgment. And the court judgment is simply saying that the decision by regulatory body is not rational. And it may be strange to you, but that is what is happening in Japan. In the case of United States, the judgment of NRC is respected by the court judgment, but in Japan it is not the case. Simply reflecting the sort of the public acceptance. The degree of public acceptance. And so what is needed is to improve public acceptance. And even when we could overcome this court judgment problem, there are several prefecture governors which do not want to let nuclear reactors to be reoperated. And again, this is simply a reflection of lack of public acceptance in Japan. So what is needed now is to improve public acceptance. And what we are trying to do now is to invite local leaders from United States, UK, and Finland. 6 people are going to be invited in February, and we would try to let them visit local regions where nuclear facilities are located, and let them discuss with local leaders. But it's a very laborious process, but I think it is inevitable since we had an accident. But I think it is important for us to succeed in the operation because Korea or Taiwan or other ASEAN countries are watching what is happening in Japan. So I would say Japan is a sort of rich repository of energy problems, not only in the area of nuclear, but also in other areas. But if we could resolve, perhaps other countries can find solutions more easily. And so we are desperately trying to do that. Am I pessimistic? My answer is no. I'm always pessimistic about the solution. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me look for hands in the audience. Does anybody have a question? If not, I'll, Linda, anything from you? I'm going to give you a chance.
I am curious about...
Hold on just a second, and we're going to bring a microphone.
Thank you.
Hi, Linda Doman, Energy Information Administration. Thank you for a very interesting presentation, and welcome to the long-term 2050. You were even more ambitious to go to 2100, so thank you for that. Can you tell me, in your oil projections, are you including biofuels as part of oil, or where do you see biofuels as part of your scenarios?
That's an interesting question. That's what Adam asked me. But we simply try to separate oil from biofuel. I think it's simply a matter of convenience. That's why we did it. But let me explain what is happening in Japan with respect to biofuel. Biofuel is categorized as renewable energy, and so it's important. But unfortunately, most of them are imported from abroad. It could be also, Brazil, it could be Malaysia, and so as far as Japan is concerned, unless we can succeed in developing new technology to produce biofuel at an affordable cost, it doesn't help us. So we try to differentiate oil from biofuel just for that reason. But it's simply a matter of convenience. But the situation is as such. Thank you very much for your question.
Adam Siegel, Insight Firm through Analysis. Also, thank you very much, Toyota Sono. Very interesting presentation with a lot of interactions. If we go back to, I think it was about slide 4, where you laid out sort of where things were for the various scenarios and laying out. It's about that, and I believe to try to, if I caught an example correctly, the total solar 2050 in the advanced technological scenario was 2.5 terawatts globally. Well, according to Bloomberg, the minimum they expect for 2018 deployment is 107 gigawatts. It was 98 gigawatts last year. We're seeing 10, 20, 30% increase in solar. Similar, so if we look up, maybe it's past 4 then. It's a few slides past, maybe slide 5, is it? If we go back. There were numbers on one of these.
Slide 4.
That one, it has,
yeah, slide 5.
So 2.5 terawatts is the max 30 years from now. We're deploying 110, 107 or more this year, going up 10, 20, 30% per year. 32 years, just even at this number, that would put us in the range of 3.5 terawatts of new addition. Your aggressive scenario is 2.5 total. Let me do a step back. There have been a lot of critiques of IEA, EIA, and many other projections of constantly being below the curve quite significantly on renewables. Looking at that as criticism, looking at what's going on, do you have that same concern with what your projections? How are you addressing the sort of everyone, even the most optimists, are continuing to chase the deployments. It's out surpassing us. Did you perhaps think about, or are you going to do, I know it's an extended question or comment, but a scenario that says, geez, if those optimistics are really true, how does that change the game? Because I know people who are projecting more in the range of 3, 4, 5 times that number, and think that and they've been pessimistic in the past.
Well, thank you very much. It's very interesting question. But in order to invite such a question as yours, we try to tell what sort of assumption we make. I think that's quite important, and we are not necessarily too optimistic about renewable energy, particularly VRE. But at this moment, nobody knows. And for instance, it is true, say in Dubai or in Saudi Arabia, it could be 3 cents, 4 cents per kilowatt hour. But yeah, well now, but is it really reflecting the cost? It may be price, but it may not be the cost. And particularly when the share of those variable renewable energy increases, you have to think about integration cost, grid expansion cost. When we talk about our own cost of renewable energy, particularly VRE, we always try to include such integration cost and also grid expansion cost. And at this moment, what I can say is I am not too optimistic, but what we are trying to do now is to make a sort of comparative analysis among 11 countries. When we look at the statistics of IRENA, it is very interesting, but it may not be a comparison between oranges and oranges. It could be oranges and apples. For instance, in Japan, in the case of Japan, the capacity factor of the solar PV is around 12%. And in Dubai, for instance, it could be, say, 30%. And the cost could be a half or less than half. So it depends on a country. And when we compare between Germany and Japan, Japan is an isolated country surrounded by sea, but Germany has interconnections with many other countries. Particularly, Germany is in the best position or geographical position in Europe. And when they have surplus, they can export. When they do not sufficient amount of electricity, they can import. And so I think it is very interesting to compare our notes among 11 countries. We try to have our own analysis with at least 10 institutes in 10 countries. And we are trying to publicize that joint study, hopefully in 3 or 4 months. And then I could give you a more accurate answer to your question. So I think at this moment, nobody, no institute has a very accurate comparison of the cost of renewable energy. I think it's time for us to do that. And if we can have an outcome, we are happy to share with you on that.
Just one quick comment. I mentioned unexpected or unintended consequences at the very beginning, and one of the things that Toyoda-san pointed out in his slides was the potential loss of gasoline tax revenues if you have peak oil. and what that means to governments around the world. I'd also point out that the cost of renewable subsidies might continue to expand if we don't make as much progress on the cost structure. I mean, if costs come down, then maybe the subsidies aren't going to be as high. But if the costs don't come down and we continue to have subsidies in order to promote renewables, there's a revenue issue there as well. That's, to me, is an interesting one that should be modeled. Fawzi.
Thank you, Mr. Toyoda. My name is Elulu, Fawzi Elulu. I'm from EIA, and I would like to thank you for this presentation and also to approve sending your chief economist in 2 weeks to discuss assumption and methodology behind those outlooks. And I can assure you we're gonna submit him to enhanced statistical interrogation and send him back to you. But anyway, today we released at EIA our shale statistics. In the United States, it reached 5.1 million barrels per day last month, which is 52%. Shale gas, it's 49 BCF per day, which is 63%. Knowing that China, they hold very large shale resources. So in your outlook, do you take in consideration transformation or technology transfer for China that may be a major factor of the CO2 factor reduction?
Well, that's a very interesting point, and I hope you could refer to the possible exploitation of methyl hydrate in Japan. Thank you very much for reminding me of that. But I think there are two interesting points. One is that, yes, there are many countries where they have potential in developing shale gas or oil. But seemingly, the U.S. is in the best position. I think with respect to China, what they are trying to say, even themselves, is that their sort of geographical structure is quite different from that of the United States, and it's more costly. And second point that I always try to tell my colleagues in Middle East countries, Saudi, Qatar, and Abu Dhabi. If you let your oil price go up again, perhaps China would start producing shale gas or oil. And so they are very careful. I think at this moment, they have lessened from two important oil price hike. One after the two oil crises in 1970s, and it went up to the level of, say, in terms of the real price of, say, 2015, it went up to $100 per barrel. Actually, the nominal price was about $40 per barrel. But in terms of the real price of 2015, it went up to $100. And the second price hike was around 2012 or 2013, 2014. It went up over $100 per barrel. And so they have learned from those two oil price hikes. If oil price goes up perhaps over $100 per barrel in real terms, in 2015 real terms, another oil price fall come to the reality. And so I think it is true. There are many other countries where they have a potential, but unless price goes up too high, it may not be realized. And now it's a very interesting situation. Middle East country would like to see another oil price hike, but they are a little bit more careful now how far they can go. And so I am not sure whether China can do that. They are desperately trying to develop, and even now a very small amount of oil, gas and oil, shale gas and oil is produced, but even China is not very much optimistic about that. But nobody knows. So that's why it's worth making energy outlook. By having that, we could have such an interesting discussion.
So one of the interesting possibilities, I think, is that a disruptive force, in addition to the idea of electric vehicles or autonomous vehicles being a disruptive force in the oil markets, it's also possible that improvements in technology that bring costs down in places like China could be disruptive as well. So we have time for one last quick question and a quick answer.
Thank you for that excellent presentation. My name is Tarek Shah. I used to work at the Department of Energy with Adam and Linda. We did something similar. We tried to do something similar a couple years ago. And in that, we ran an advanced technology case and an advanced scenarios case. We also combined those two and found that the effects of combining the cases was greater than just adding them up. And I'm wondering if you ran an advanced technology scenario and a peak oil demand scenario with the values from the advanced technology case and what that might do for CO2 emissions.
So did you or could you run a scenario that combined advanced technology and peak oil?
Right.
Well, so before I answer to your question, did you find a difference between two analyses? What you have done and what we have done?
I would have to dive more in, but we didn't, just like you did, we didn't get close to the 80% by 2050 goals.
So Tarek was saying that in his modeling, they didn't get to the goal by 2050 either.
Well, I think no analysis can be perfect. I think the most important thing is to compare our notes and try to learn lessons. I wouldn't say our analysis is the best one, but what we would like to do is to stimulate other institutes or companies to make a similar analysis and with some assumption disclosed. Otherwise, it's a black box, and so we try to stimulate other institutions and companies to disclose their assumptions. Otherwise, we cannot make a comparison. So I'm not trying to say our analysis is the perfect one, but probably several analyses like this could help many people understand what is the reality.
To me, it's a very similar story. I think when I first got the EIA, I was somewhat skeptical of what the long-term forecasts were going to give because they always seem to come up with answers that are very different from what we end up getting even in the medium term. But what I've come to realize, I think, the value in the longer-term forecasts is not the end point numbers, predictions, but rather the deltas between the scenarios that you run, which is, and I think it comes back to the question about have many of the forecasting agencies been underestimating the cost reductions in renewables. EIA did try to run a lower cost renewable scenario, a no sunset scenario where the subsidies were kept on, and it does make a difference, and I think it is a worthwhile thing to do. Interestingly, even in the peak oil demand scenario that IEEJ ran in 2050, there's still 90 million barrels a day of demand for oil. It's 30 million barrels a day below what the reference case was, but it's still a big number, which requires big investments. I imagine with a stronger renewables, addition in there, you could cut that number further, but still supplying that level of oil demand is something that is, to me, probably a very important thing to consider. And finding ways to capture and sequester carbon in some way, or move more quickly towards carbon-free solutions, also sounds like something that policymakers should continue to explore, and I think efforts are being made along those lines, so thank you. Won't you please join me in thanking Masakazu Toyoda for his presentation.